I am really excited about receiving additional understanding of how our Creator's Word ties in the Feast of Temporary Dwellings with purging out evil from within us. His entire plan for us to become His revolves around desiring His righteousness. This life that He gave us in the flesh really is a testing and a proving grounds. We need to treat it as such. As all of this comes together, it is awesome to understand why His three commanded feasts are timed with the 3 harvests each year. It is all about food, and it's all about food for a reason. The Feast of Unleavened Bread accompanies the spring harvest. Celebrating the Passover night precedes entering into this feast. Talked about that in other videos, how important the Passover night is. This is why it was also referred to as the Feast of the Passover in some places. Many understand, at least in theory, that the unleavened bread represents the Word of Elohim and that Yeshua became His Word. And He told us to follow Him in order to become His Word as well. His Word defines His righteousness, and it teaches His righteousness to us with His 7 spirits guiding us. His unleavened bread is what is to feed us. It needs to be our sole source for what feeds our minds. We become what we eat. Or a better way to say it is we become what we feed our minds with. If we feed our minds with the with the leavened bread of men, this is what we become. And we become His enemies. This spring feast is symbolic of the journey of purging out all leavening in our minds and filling them with His unleavened bread. And it leads to the second feast, the Feast of First Fruits, which accompanies the summer harvest. It is on this day next year when Yeshua will return to harvest the rest of the first fruits into His Father's kingdom. These 144,000 first fruits let His unleavened bread become their source for all instructions, became their nutrition. They are the first fruits of what His unleavened bread produced. They became spiritual virgins because they left the whoredom of the leavening of the world for His kingdom's sake. They understood the importance of the report card, and they desired their Creator's righteous judgment that all are measured, or all will be measured with. The Feast of Temporary Dwellings represents the testing system that our Creator has in place, or a part of it. It ties it all together anyhow. He has had me focus on some verses of Deuteronomy 14 these last few days, verses 25 and 26. Then you shall turn it, referring to the tithe, into money, and bind up the money in your hand, and go to the place which Yahweh Elohim has chosen. And you shall bestow that money for whatsoever your soul desires, for oxen, or for sheep, or for wine, or for strong drink, or whatsoever your soul desires, and you shall eat there before Yahweh Elohim, and you shall rejoice, you and your household. Again, he is using food and drink for symbolism, tying this all together. And he is setting up a test. He has led me to tie in these verses with the fruit from the goodly trees that we are to bring into our huts with us during the Feast of Temporary Dwellings. A couple of days ago I spoke that the Hebrew word that they translated into goodly means majesty or glorious or that which is honorable. We are to save up a tithe of our increase each year in addition to our other offerings and go to His feast and purchase whatsoever our soul desires. He did this to test us and to prove us if we would love Him with our entire beings or love the ways of the world and become His enemies. He wants us entering into our huts, which represent our bodies, which are also temporary dwellings, with the fruit from the glorious trees. I marvel at this and understanding what He is, the understanding that He is telling us is exciting. He showed me the other day how He tied this fruit in with the tree of life in the garden and with the vine that Yeshua became, which is His Father's logos. And He showed us how the branches of this temporary dwelling that we walk in need to be branches of His logos. He has shown us this feast, how our heart's desires are the telltale indicators of where our hearts really are at. It all goes back to what we eat. We eat what we desire to if we can. And of course, if you're saving up 10%, for going to this feast, you're going to be able to eat what you desire. So it's just a test for us. It is where our desires are that mold and fashion our thoughts. To either become as the world is or to become as He is. The Feast of Temporary Dwellings represents the test that all will need to pass in order to be gathered into his kingdom. This is why it is also called the Feast of Ingathering in the Scriptures. And I've spoke about how at the end of the 7,000 years of his plan, we'll have a great white throne judgment when there'll be a larger harvest. We are to enter into these huts and measure our desires against the fruit that comes from the tree of majesty. Everything centers around the measuring rod that he has given to us. We don't have to guess, and we don't have to learn from our mistakes. We don't need the school of hard knocks. All we need to do is believe him. It really is that simple. Yesterday I gave some examples of hindsight being 20/20 and did not really expand on them, nor did I really know the extent of why they popped into my mind at the time. I was reflecting back on the time when my father was calling me out of the deception and how there were red flags all around me, that I was in one of Satan's many camps. I could see these red flags and they troubled me because I was being called by his seven spirits and they were letting me see them. And all of this was teaching me to measure all things against his word. And this is what we all must do. And we must bring every thought that we have into subjection to his will. And this requires our thoughts to be on his will. And in order to do this, we have to know what his will for our thoughts is. He wants us to be as he is. He wants our thoughts to be in agreement with his thoughts. And of course, we need something to measure that with. It was his seven spirits that were calling me that allowed me to see the red flags around me in this false organization that I was walking with. But how did I know that it was his seven spirits and not the spirit of the enemy that was trying to call me away? How did I know that my disdain for these things, that I mentioned a couple of them yesterday, was not my own judgment, but rather our Creator's righteous judgment? It was simple. All that I needed to do was compare my thoughts to his word. In regards to yesterday's examples, our Creator's word teaches that we are to build huts for this feast, so I believed the spirit that was asking me to question why we were not building huts, but staying in hotels instead. And his word teaches that it is shameful for women to dress the way that they dress today. So I believe the judgment in my mind was not my own judgment. Again, referring to what I spoke of yesterday. It was the same judgment that testified to me that Saul of Tarsus is the abomination of desolation, because Yahweh's word testifies that he is. I say is instead of was because his writings are still desolating the truth in the hearts of billions. Back then, referring to when I was still in the captivity, these same spirits were letting me see the red flags in my own life as well, and they still do. An example of this is I began to loathe my obsession that I had for Nebraska football, because it took my focus away from that which my heart was beginning to hunger and thirst for. I had a choice. I could either resist the spirits that were calling me to change my thoughts, and I could have held on to my desire, or I could have let these guiding spirits help me change my desires. We all have these choices. If the bread of men is your heart's desire, then you have a circumcision of the heart problem. Our heart's desires must be for our Creator's righteousness and for his kingdom. This is what we must hunger and thirst for. And this is what he's looking for. He's looking for hearts that will hunger and thirst for his righteousness. As I said, our desires are the telltale indicators of where our hearts are. Our Creator's seven spirits allows us to see the unrighteousness of those around us and how they have no shame. They allow us to see the hypocrisies and the unrighteousness in our own lives as well. But we cannot even tell whether our thoughts are being influenced by his spirits or by the spirits of the enemy without the measuring rod. And we need to fear being wrong. That's the eye salve I keep speaking of. And then search out to be in agreement with him. It is more than just our desires that we need to measure. It is also whether we are bearing our Creator's righteousness or not. If we are not bearing his righteous judgments, this actually comes from a lack of desire, because we have to hunger and thirst for his righteousness to become ours. So a lack of desire actually produces the not having eyes to see as well. If we don't desire the truth, we're not going to have it shown to us. We are either bearing his name or we are bearing the name of the adversary. There is no middle ground. If we have no shame for not being in agreement with his righteous judgments, then we have a circumcision of the heart problem again. After recording yesterday's video, I wondered why I brought up those couple of examples and thought about re-recording and removing them, but then he showed me how he was tying this all together. We must be vigilant and measure all things against his measuring rod, or else we cannot see evil for what it is, and we let evil become us. It becomes our thoughts, or remains our thoughts. If we have, of course, we're walking in the dark anyhow, we just remain in the dark. If we're going to purge out evil, it must first be recognized, both in ourselves and in those that we fellowship with. We are to be our brother's keepers, and if they will not hearken to our Creator's righteous judgments, they are not to be our brothers, and we are to cast them out from us. This is why Yeshua said that he judges no man, yet his judgment is true. We are not to judge one another with man's judgment, but we are to judge all things according to our Creator's righteous judgment that he gave us in his word. My desiring Nebraska football was evil because it was contrary to why I was created, and it was contrary to me receiving the circumcised heart that my Father was wanting to give to me. Knowing this is something to rejoice in indeed. Delighting in his righteousness is something to rejoice in indeed. Knowing what he is building is something to rejoice in indeed. It should be our heart's desire to one day be in his family forever. Having our hearts circumcised by him to become his heart, to become like his heart, is something to rejoice in indeed. Looking forward to being out of this temporary body and brought into a family that loves as he loves is really something to rejoice in indeed. We just need to make sure that we are becoming likewise ourselves so that we will pass the test, and this is why we need to measure our thoughts and our desires, or measure our lack of them. Being told to buy the desires of our hearts at the feast and tying it into food and drink is a wonderful illustration that our Creator gave us to warn us, especially when you tie this in with what he instructed us in his word when he told us to bring the fruit from the goodly or the glorious trees into our temporary dwellings. His word and his instructions are beautiful indeed. They are a roadmap, but he wants us desiring his meat and drink in order to even understand the roadmap. If you're going to go shack up in a hotel for his set-apart feast and not build a temporary dwelling like he commanded you to do in his word, why do you think that he would give you understanding of his roadmap? These are not the hearts that he is looking for. It's not who he gives his spirits to. This feast is to be an awesome time to measure ourselves by measuring the desires of our hearts or the lack of desires for his righteousness to be ours. It is to be a time of measuring what food and drink that we feed our minds with for the whole year, not just during this feast. Just as with what his other appointed times teaches, we are to bind these instructions on our hand and in our forehead. We're to practice them throughout the year. It's what we're to think on. It's to be our thoughts always. Talking about them from the time we get up in the morning to the time we retire in the evening, and meditating on them in the night watches even, as the scriptures say. We should be forever mindful of what he is purposing to accomplish in us in these temporary dwellings all year long, not just at this feast. We should always measure what our thoughts consider good versus evil with his measuring rod, and seek to grow in understanding of his righteous judgment as well, to keep growing in understanding of his measuring rod. Because as we get closer, he keeps refining that, keeps purifying our thoughts. Do you wink at evil with no shame, or are the abominations of the world detestable to you? Our Creator says that the mark that those who will be delivered through his coming wrath have in their foreheads is they cry and sigh over all of the abominations done in their midst. He says that friendship with the ways of the world makes you his enemies. I don't think it is going to be good to be his enemy when he lets his wrath loose. If the spirit that is guiding you does not loathe the world as it is today, you have a different spirit guiding you than his spirit according to his measuring rod. Moses recorded him commanding us in Deuteronomy 10, "Therefore circumcise the foreskin of your heart, and do not be stiff-necked." He said this after he said that we are required to fear not doing as he said, and that's the eye salve, and that we are required to walk in his ways and to serve him and to love him with all of our heart and with our entire life. He is to be our delight. We are to rejoice in his ways. His ways are to be our food and our strong drink that we desire. 3 verses before this, he said that he gave us his commandments and statutes for our good, and he did. They really are to be rejoiced in. And him choosing to make us into his family is an awesome reality to delight in. If you are being led by a spirit that is not in agreement with his word in any way, flee from it, and let his unleavened bread become your meat, and his son's blood your drink. Examine the desires of your heart, or the lack of desire for his righteousness to become yours. His logos is what the living waters flow out from. Anoint your eyes with his eye salve and cry out to him to receive his 7 spirits to guide you into all truth. And for those of you who are celebrating his feast in spirit and truth this year, you have much to rejoice in indeed. Blessed is the one who walks bearing the name of Yahweh Elohim in spirit and in truth.